this is Nathan with a reading of a short story from a recently published book of translations, short fiction by Abdona Bidia. The book was first published in 1989 as Divertinventos, un libro de fantasías e utopías, and now is out as an ebook in English under the title of Funventions, a book of fantasies and utopias. I'm going to read the introduction and then read one of the books in the volume entitled Edible, one of the stories in the volume entitled Edible Books. Introduction. One can get an impression of Plato's Greece, St. Augustine's Rome, and Thomas More's England through reading their respective utopias. There are many other examples, but it's not necessary to list them. The paradox is obvious. Not even those powerful minds could break the limits of their place and their time. They could not, and in the end, neither did they propose to, invent the other, the distinct, the radically ideal. This means that their utopias did in fact have a place on the earth, because they referred back to an unequivocal reality, that of their authors. To dream up an authentic utopia is impossible. This curious limitation has a flip side. If, on the one hand, it prevents us from completely fleeing from the world that surrounds and penetrates us, on the other hand, it highlights our need to negate that world, or to rename it, which amounts to the same thing. With that in mind, I've created this book of fantasies and utopias, some of whose texts take place in, if you will, exotic locales, perhaps Germany or Japan, or another one of those strange countries about which we know many things, but no doubt remain ignorant of many more. If we transfer these occurrences to a distant, imaginary territory, and if we leave behind our immediate references, landscapes, etc., it's possible that in exchange we will obtain a clearer picture of our dreams, desires, fears, and uncertainties. 1989. So, translator's note. Thus, the following fantasy can be seen as a portrait of Ecuador in the 1980s, but also of the dreams, desires, fears, and uncertainties that are the same wherever and whenever we are. Edible books. Hunger invents desperate solutions. One day, that which happens to many people happened to Bloom. He got tired of being poor, and he stopped writing books and set out to make them. From one day to the next, he reinvented himself as an editor. But neither his hunger nor his ego would permit anything less. He had to be the editor of very original books, edible ones. The pages, baked from a dough very similar to that of communion wafers, but flexible. The ink, a black syrup. The covers, large rectangular cookies. So that everyone except collectors and the eccentric literally devoured their books as they went along. Or, better, they savored them. Thus, they assimilated the texts more directly and completely. This business quickly became a success. Bloom promoted it expertly. His old love of words served him like a charm. He himself wrote the press releases, the television and radio commercials, the jacket blurbs. The motto of his company was, "Good taste in books." Bloom began to become rich. To keep things fresh, and especially to maintain his advantage over the inevitable imitators, he devised new product lines. Books flavored with chocolate, vanilla, coffee. Edible blank books. Also, inedible books, which were not well received because people complained that there was no way to tell them apart from ordinary books. The flavored books, however, enjoyed remarkable success. An enormous novel that told the story of a fish had its pages impregnated with its aroma. Another novel was about a long banquet enjoyed by some recently retired judges. As the text went on, different flavors came and went: ham, chicken, lamb, strawberries and cream, and more. And Bloom began to become very rich. His political and commercial connections increased daily. One winter afternoon, when the windows were coated with frost and the sky was like a great black stone, the poet Gray came calling. Gray had been Bloom's comrade in the bad old days. Bloom felt a pang of dread as he watched him stalk in through the office door like an unlucky shadow, thin, poor, and lost. Bloom couldn't guess what was going on in the other man's mind, and for a second it seemed to him as if he were seeing himself as he had been years before, entering that office that, for a moment, ceased to be his. Gray muttered, "I've come to sell you an idea." Bloom's heart, cast into shadow, responded, "What are you doing here? Get out. Go back to your past, your misery, your subversive impulses. Don't screw up my day, Gray. I'm not who I used to be. I'm different. I have other ideas and a new position in the world. We have nothing to discuss." That's what Bloom's heart said. But his mouth, empty and hollow like all mouths, limited itself to saying, "As you can see, I'm not short of ideas." "Then I'll go," was Gray's only response. Bloom should have taken advantage of Gray's dry and unpleasant attitude, lifted himself out of his enormous leather seat, situated behind the enormous executive desk, crushed Gray's hand in a definitive farewell, and growled to him, "Yes, get out of here, and don't come back. Don't ever come near me again. You've chosen your life, now accept the consequences. I want to forget about you. You're nothing but a residue of the past and some ideas I've resolved to forget. I don't want to change the world anymore. Instead, the world has changed me. I chose to let it do this. I'm not the word weaver anymore, the prophet of utopias and dreams that never come true. I've become a man of the world, and your presence is threatening my world. Go on, get out! You won't get anything from me." That's what he should have said. But his voice formed very different words. "Hold on. Talk to me." Gray spoke about his idea. In other circumstances, Bloom would have trashed it. His personal prides would have sounded in his head like the squeal of brakes. But at this moment that didn't happen, because behind Gray's words, Bloom discovered the tardy arrival of a defeated being who implored him for one last chance to take a seat on that punctual train he had always scorned. This poet, now older, overwhelmed by doubts, at the age of 40, wanted to initiate himself into the world of business. That's how Bloom understood the situation. Gray's proposal was to add drugs to the edible books, aphrodisiacs to the erotic novels, hallucinogens to the fantasies, and stimulants to the adventures. He had even imagined a number of series of therapeutic works. For example, a series of novels dedicated to insomniacs, with the pages dosed with soporifics. As far as the strictly literary content of this series was concerned, that would be easy to find. The verbalists who seek to center the interest of literature not in story, scene, and character, but in language itself and its capricious games, could offer up texts aplenty to numb the brains and give peaceful and healthy dreams to even the most hardened insomniacs. When Gray finished explaining his idea, Bloom savored like the aftertaste of a warm and delicate liqueur that had just passed down his throat, the sweet proof that his friend was now, through fragility and repentance, a man like him. Gray, too, had renounced the illusory world of impossible values, of holy proposals, of invectives, of radical marginalizations and nonconformities. Gray, too, had turned his eyes to the things of this world, to to the stubborn realities that only money and power can grant. Bloom said to himself, "This poor man has come to your garden. Let him in. Let him wander its paths. He has abandoned his dark mountains. He is no longer the famished beast who roars his freedom and rage among the weeds. You will have him at your service, domesticated and peaceful. You will use him as you wish. In this way you will be revenged upon one who, during many sleepless nights of doubt, tortured your mind with what your life could have been if you had continued with your verses in your useless rebellions. Let him in. He will be a captive ghost, a sorrowful and diffuse phantom, tangled in the thorns of your rose bushes." "All right," said Bloom. "I'm going to hire you. I hope your product works. You will have a well-stocked office and a young and compliant secretary." Gray began to work in Bloom's company, and that brusque, high-strung, bird-like man demonstrated a very great talent for commerce. He hired new people and hosted internal seminars with the participation of chemists and cooks who understood him well. The new additions multiplied, and Bloom began to suspect that wealth was like a whirlpool that grew magically from its own center, stronger and faster all the time. The books ceased to be a luxury and became a necessity. It became customary at elegant dinners to serve as a dessert delicious booklets filled with the verses of tragic poets. The chemical additives guaranteed to those who consumed them at least an hour of lively and even intelligent conversation. And thus passed 1, 2, 3 years. Another winter afternoon, Gray went to see Bloom. "I've come to submit my resignation," he said. Bloom, shocked, whispered one word: "Why?" That word contained many other words. Didn't he think his percentage was fair? Had he not enjoyed sufficient autonomy in his work? Didn't his labors make him happy? Did he long for the wilderness wastelands and miss the useless claws of the paper tiger he had been? Did the poor man consider himself so necessary as to believe that Bloom would beg him to stay? Had he now saved enough money to escape debt and the police for the remainder of his days? "That's none of your business. It's just over for me here. I'm fed up." Gray interrupted Bloom's sudden introspection. "That's fine. Scram," Bloom responded. "But first I want to launch my book of poems at a big book release party. I wrote the book 3 years ago before I..." Gray fell silent with a grimace and a disdainful gesture. "I presume you've taken care of the mixtures and everything? It's all set, but look, I want you to see the invitation list." Bloom scanned the photocopied page. On it were the names of the most refined, elegant, and powerful men of the nation, the greatest rogues in all its history. They would come accompanied, no doubt, by their inevitable cohort of lackeys and bootlickers. "You want to go out with a bang, do you?" "If that's how you want to look at it, I just want you to promise me that you'll invite them." "All right," Bloom murmured. He looked at the other man with a gaze that was both tired and wary, and thought, "I certainly don't know you now. I suppose that your psychological profile has been blurring little by little in my mind in the time that you've worked for me. What you're asking is something I didn't expect from you. I can't understand your reasoning. It could be that you've opted for cynicism and you think that this act will benefit your future. It could be that your cynicism is another provocation. In that case, I accept the challenge. I'm confident of where I stand. If I can stretch out a bridge for you to those people, I'll do it. They don't scare me, not even as associates. It could be that you want to make your own alliance with them, and that's the reason for your sudden resignation from my company. Or it might be something else, some impulse I can't make out now, some flashback to your mad days. If it's that, you won't take me by surprise. All right, Bloom repeated, but I want to see your book. It's being bound right now. I'll give it to you in good time. The day before the launching, Gray presented Bloom with a copy of his new book, Invoice. This is the first copy to come off the press, he said. I want you to keep it, read it, and don't eat it. In the solitude of his office, when the last secretary had gone home, Bloom went over the roughly laid out pages, which, to his disgusted eyes, seemed to be made of something closely resembling ordinary paper. Just as he had suspected, the poetry was the same aggressive trash Gray had been writing 20 years earlier. It hadn't changed a bit. The same iconoclasm, the same disdainful rage. Suddenly, Bloom's eyes skidded to a halt at some lines that resounded in his brain like distant echoes. May the words burn. May the words roam their entrails like angry acids. May the words damage and kill. A cold, greasy sweat moistened Bloom's forehead. The origin of those lines came into his memory with the force of a strong wind. He himself had written them many years before. What was Gray thinking of when he included them in his book? What kind of insane act was Gray planning for the presentation of Invoice? The book's pages smelled like fresh ink. Bloom couldn't sleep that night. He wasn't only thinking about Gray and his demented anger. He was also thinking about himself, about the man he had ceased to be. Starting at the moment he renounced his other destiny, that epic brilliance that was supposed to have been his life as a great poet and rebel. Turning away from that passion, faith, insanity, or whatever you want to call it, he had obtained many things of this world, including the delicate woman who slept by his side. Many things, yes. Concrete and material, yes. Although the fountain of silvery water had run dry in his heart. Only when it was very nearly dawn did hatred come to his aid. In the evening, the book launching began, as such things always did, with the national anthem and a panel discussion of Gray's previous work. But as soon as Gray passed out his books, and before anyone sampled them, Bloom took the microphone and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, please do not taste this book. Leaf through it carefully. Perhaps you know of that novel in which a monk murders other monks with the poisoned pages of a book. Well, the author of Invoice has attempted to do the same to us. The pages of this book are poisoned. Keep it, if you will, as a souvenir and as a warning, but lock it away. At the last moment, I discovered his plan. I've saved your lives. This man's hatred for society has no limits. He considers all of us gathered here today to be responsible for the world's problems. Even me, though I did my best to help him. But don't worry, the police will take care of him. Look at him now. Watch how his face grows pale. Think how ridiculous he must feel. Consider his shame and his fear. See how he trembles. And this cowardly assassin had the nerve to judge us, to declare us guilty and condemn us to death." After the initial uproar, the attendees filed out of the hall. And as Bloom had said, Gray was arrested. 2 weeks later, Bloom received a visit from the chief of police. Robust, 50-something, with the imperturbable gaze of those people who are convinced that the world is how it is and never any other way, the chief laid out for Bloom his discoveries and suspicions. As the man spoke, Bloom understood not only that the whole story of poisons had been an involuntary invention of his own mind, but also that for him The poet Gray was not a man of flesh and blood, but that stubborn archetype, the evil shadow, the clamor of a recurrent past, which, despite all Bloom's attempts to expel it, had never really left his life. "Sir," said the police chief, "we analyzed the books. They contain no poison of any kind. The strangest thing is that they are made up of paper and ink, just like ordinary books. They're completely inedible. We haven't turned up anything in our interrogations of Mr. Gray, either. I personally believe that if he isn't talking, it's because he has nothing to say. In any case, he did ask you to come and see him. You might be able to help us clear this up." That's how Bloom found himself in Gray's cell. As a result of the interrogations, the poet looked like an image of Christ, scourged and bleeding, that you might see in a church. After a pause, the poet spoke. "Go on. Get out of here now." Bloom didn't say a word. He left. He walked the streets. He went into a cafe. He ordered a coffee, but didn't drink it. He walked back to where he had parked his car. He drove in random directions. He went into one bar after another. He went around and around until the night was no longer young and his wife would be too sleepy to talk to him. But he didn't go home. He went to his office. He closed the blinds to shut out the deceitful lights of the city and sat, surrounded by darkness, in his chair of black leather. And he did not want to sleep. And it was then that he was able to carry on the impossible dialogue with that badly beaten man who had seen him from a corner of the cell. And he was able to ask him why he had wanted to invite all those powerful people. And the man answered that they were the same people that he, Bloom, had invited on other occasions. And Bloom asked him why he had had the books printed with ink on paper. And the other answered that he had wanted them to last. And Bloom asked him if he hadn't had a hidden purpose for this. And the other responded that yes, he had. In that way, the books would enter those people's houses, and perhaps their children and their servants would read them and feel disgust for their parents and their masters. And Bloom asked him why he had included that poem from Bloom's own youth. And the other answered that it was so that the poem would not disappear, because the poem still existed, although it no longer had an author. And Bloom asked him if he had imagined that Bloom might think the books were poisoned and falsely accuse him of a terrible crime. And the other responded that no one can imagine the fabrications that old fears construct in empty hearts. And Bloom asked him so many things, and they each had an exact answer in the depths of his brain, while the night flowed slowly by like a black river. Then day came, and other days came. Gray was released from prison and soon vanished from the public eye, bearing the stigma of an accusation that no one cleared up. Bloom continued working in his office with the same schedule. Everything seemed to have returned to normal. Nevertheless, a sensation of emptiness grew in Bloom's heart. One night he dreamt that the building in which he edited the edible books began to fall apart. The walls split, the ceilings caved in, the machines fell down into deep cracks in the earth. In the dream, Bloom watched the disaster with indifference and disdain. It was strange. He felt exactly as Gray would have felt watching it. He just didn't care.